lecture, we're going to start talking about vision, one of the special senses. The special senses include smell, taste, sight, hearing, and equilibrium. And so we'll cover those eventually. Today we're going to start with sight. We take a lot of information in through our eyes, and 70% of all sensory receptors are in the eyes. And each eye has over 1 million nerve fibers, so they're highly innervated. Protection for the eye is the bony orbit that surrounds your eye. Sometimes that's called your eye socket. And then there's also a cushion of fat that surrounds most of the eye. When people have like anorexia, for example, some of that fat can start to degrade, and they actually can't see as straight as people who are not anorexic because their eyes are not cushioned properly. Around the eye are several accessory structures. They include the eyelids and eyelashes, the conjunctiva, the lacrimal apparatus, and the extrinsic eye muscles.
So in this diagram, you can see some of the structures that are associated with the eye and the eye itself. So with the eye itself, the iris is the part of your eye that is colored. Your eyelids are what covers your eyes when you blink, when you sleep, close your eyes, etc. The pupil is the structure in the center of your eye. It looks black. It is what allows light into your eye so that you can see. And then eyelashes and eyebrows help keep debris out of your eyes, and we can talk about all the rest of the structures in a minute. So some of the accessory structures include the eyelids and the eyelashes. The eyelids meet at the medial and lateral commissure, or canthus, and then the eyelashes have tarsal glands. They produce an oily secretion that helps to lubricate your eyes. And then there's also a gland called the ciliary glands, and they're located between the eyelashes. The lining of your eyelids is called the conjunctiva. So it's a membrane that lines your eyelids. It connects to the outer surface of the eye, and it secretes mucus, and that lubricates the eye and keep it moist. So when eyes are dry, that's when this is activated so that your eyes can be more lubricated. Another set of structures are called the lacrimal apparatus, and it's made up of the lacrimal gland and then the lacrimal ducts. So the lacrimal gland produces something called lacrimal fluid. That's situated on the lateral aspect of each eye. And then there's a structure called the lacrimal canaliculi, and those drain lacrimal fluid from the eyes, and those are medial, so those are towards the midline of your body. The lacrimal sac provides a passage of lacrimal fluid towards the nasal cavity. So when your eyes water and you're draining fluid from your eyes, unless you're crying and it's coming down the outside of your face, it can drain into your nasal cavity. And it does that through the nasolacrimal duct. That's what empties lacrimal fluid into the nasal cavity. And so when your eyes are producing a normal amount of fluid, it generally is drained into the nasal cavity through the nasolacrimal duct. So in this diagram, you can see what the eye looks like when the eye is closed. The posterior side of the eye is here. So that's the back of your eyeball, where it is on the back side of the socket where your eye sits. And then the anterior side is here, so that's where you see and let light in and things like that. Here you can see the lacrimal gland. So that's this structure right here, and that produces some of the fluid that helps to lubricate your eyes. And then it has a duct that can drain onto kind of this conjunctiva, or between the layers of the conjunctiva here. And then that conjunctiva, like we talked about, lines the inside of the eyelid and then the surface of the eyeball. You can also see here where the eyelashes attach to the eyelid, and then the tarsal glands that are associated with the edges of your eyelids. Here's another view of some of those structures so you can see where it's situated on your face. So the lacrimal gland is kind of on the lateral upper aspect of the eye, kind of right underneath that ridge of brow bone that goes above your eye. And then it sends fluid through these lacrimal ducts, and then these fluids tend to travel across the eye from lateral to medial, and then the lacrimal sac and the lacrimal canaliculus both help the eye drain to the nasal cavity, and then finally it all drains down through the nasolacrimal duct. The functions of that lacrimal apparatus are several. It protects the eye, it moistens the eye, and it lubricates the eye. And then all of its secretions are emptied into the nasal cavity. and it includes the lacrimal solutions or secretions are also called tears, right? And so they're dilute salt solution, which you could probably guess if you've ever tasted your tears, they're a little bit salty. And it also contains a little bit of mucus, some antibodies, and lysosomes, and those are enzymes that destroy bacteria, and those help to keep your eyes from being susceptible to infection. Another accessory structure of the eye are the extrinsic eye muscles. And so these are 6 little muscles that attach to the outer surface of the eye, and their job is to produce your eye movements. So in humans, our eyes are not fixed in one direction. We can look straight ahead, but we can also use our eyes to look peripherally to the left or to the right. Some animals can't do that. So if you were an owl, for example, and you wanted to see what was over your left shoulder, you'd have to turn your whole head in order to see that. And instead, you can just use your eyes, keep your head still, and look over to the side. So not all animals have these extrinsic eye muscles, but humans do. So in this diagram, you can see how the muscles are attached to the eyeball, and it allows it to move. And so remember the way that muscles work. Like for example, this is the lateral rectus muscle. And if this were to contract, then it would allow the person to look laterally or over their shoulder, right? And then if the muscle on the other side, which would be medial, that would allow the person to look like towards their nose, essentially. And then in this diagram, you can also see the optic nerve that extends from the back of the eye into the brain. This is just another view of the muscles on the eye, and so you can see there's muscles that allow the eye to look left and right, and muscles that allow the eye to look up and down. So you're able to have a full range of motion within the eye socket. And if you're wondering what those muscles do, here's what we can see. So the lateral rectus moves the eye laterally, so that means away from the midline. That's where you'd look out towards your shoulder. The medial rectus moves the eye medially, so that allows your eye to look towards your nose or towards the midline of your body. The superior rectus elevates the eye and turns it medially. The inferior rectus depresses the eye, so you look down, and turns it medially. The inferior oblique elevates the eye and turns it laterally. And the superior oblique depresses the eye and turns it laterally. Next, we'll talk about the structure of the eye, and it has several different layers. So the fibrous layer is the outside layer, and then there's a vascular layer, which is the middle layer, and then the sensory layer, which is the innermost layer. In this diagram, you can see some of the different layers of the eye. So things like the sclera would be that outermost layer of the eye. The mid layer would include the choroid, and then the innermost layer, which is the sensory layer, is the retina. This is a cadaver eyeball, so you can kind of see what it looks like in a real person. And again, you've got the sclera, the outermost layer, the choroid, that middle vascular layer, and the retina, which is the sensory layer. We can talk about the jobs of each of these layers. So in the fibrous layer, the sclera is the white connective layer. It's seen anteriorly. We call it the whites of the eyes, so that's your sclera. And then the cornea is transparent, and it's the central anterior portion. So this is where light passes through your eye. So this is where the pupil is located. The cornea is really easily repaired. So if you scratch a cornea, as long as it doesn't get an ulcer, it heals really quickly. It's the only human tissue that can be transplanted without fear of rejection. So if people have had eye damage, they can actually have a corneal transplant from a cadaver. Next, we'll talk about the vascular layer. So this is the second layer, or the middle layer. So the choroid is a blood-rich nutritive layer in the posterior of the eye. So that provides some of the nutrients to the eye. And pigment prevents light from scattering too much, so that assists with vision. And then modified anteriorly, it's in 2 different structures. So on the anterior side of the eye, the structure has been modified into the ciliary body, which is the smooth muscles that attach to the lens in your eye. The lens in your eye can actually change shape, so you can focus on things that are different distances from your eye. And so in order for that lens to change shape, smooth muscle pulls the lens into a flatter shape or a less flat shape. And then there's also a structure called the iris. The iris regulates the amount of light that is entering the eye. So there's the pigmented layer, which is where you get your eye color, and then the pupil is the opening within the iris. That's that black spot in the middle of your eye. And then in the sensory layer, you have the retina, and it contains two layers. There's an outer pigmented layer and then an inner neural layer. And the inner neural layer is what contains those photoreceptors. Those are the structures in your eyes that collect light, and those are called rods and cones. So within the sensory layer, signals pass from the photoreceptors via a two neuron chain. And there's a couple kinds of cells that help with this. There's bipolar neurons and ganglion cells. The signal leaves the retina and it goes towards the brain through the optic nerve. So you have an optic nerve that leads each of your eyeballs. And at the back of your retina, where the optic nerve leaves, you have a structure called the optic disc. And this is also called your blind spot, and it's because you can't see images if they're focused onto the optic disc. So when we hopefully we'll have time to do a lab where you can test where your optic disc is, because you can literally make something invisible to your own eye if you have it lined up with your optic disc. So in this diagram, it shows the neural pathway that an impulse goes through when when light has hit your retina. So the light will hit this surface on the back of your eye, which is your retina, and then that message goes through the ganglion cells, the bipolar cells, and then to the rods and cones. You can see in this diagram where the optic disc is. So in this region, there is no place where there's rods and cones or receptive material or nerve cells, and so that's why that's your blind spot, because light that strikes that place cannot be detected by the neurons in your eyes, and so that is where no image can be created. One of the types of neurons that is found in your retina are the rods. So these are one of those types of cells that are able to detect light and use that to form an image. The rods are found mostly towards the edges of the retina. They allow you to see in dim light, and also they assist with peripheral vision. And all of the perceptions from the rods is in gray tones. So these are not the cells in your eye that help you detect colors, but they do help you to detect light and motion and peripheral vision. Cones, on the other hand, allow for detailed color vision. These are densest in the center of the retina, and there's a structure called the fovea centralis. This is lateral to the blind spot. This is where there is only cones located in the eye, and this is where your visual acuity is the sharpest. So at the fovea centralis, that is where you can see the most detail and the best color vision. There is, however, as mentioned before, no photoreceptors at the optic disc or your blind spot. So any light that hits that is not going to be converted to an image in your brain. Cone cells can be further divided because they have different sensitivities. So there's 3 different types of cones, and each cone is sensitive to different wavelengths of light. If a person has color blindness, it's because they are lacking one of the types of cones. Generally speaking, people who are colorblind can see color, they just cannot see the full range of visible light. So the 3 different types of cones that are found in your eye are the blue cones, and they see this kind of 420 nanometer range in that kind of blue indigo violet area. And then there's the green cones that see kind of in that 530 nanometer wavelength range, and they help you with greens and things like that. And then the red cones are kind of that 560 nanometer range, and they help you see with reds and oranges and yellows and things like that. So between those 3 different types of cone cells, you're able to see a vast array of colors. If somebody is missing some of those cone cells, then they're unable to differentiate light that is from those wavelengths.